town. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first visit in Cambodia. I'm really, really honored by the invitation from esteemed colleagues from the Zaman University. I'm here to meet with our colleagues to improve the quality of research in public policy in Cambodia, but also to learn. I'm interested in your ideas as well, so I hope we'll have some opportunity for discussion and the opportunity for me to learn as well. It's not just me imparting ideas, I'm really sincerely interested in your thoughts as well. What I'm going to talk about primarily is how to think about difficult problems. So not just what are the answers, but how might we come to an understanding of them. So I'll talk about modern political economy. Here's the first one that most people need to be reminded of. It's obvious when you think about it, but most people forget it. And that is the distinction between intentions and consequences. They are not the same thing. They're not equal. Many people fail to remember this. When a politician promotes a law, they say, look at the intention, and they want you to judge them on their intention. I think we should judge them on the consequences, not only the intention. So I was in Thailand recently, before coming here, and the Thai government did some things that had maybe good intentions, but terrible consequences. The rice subsidy scheme. They offered to pay farmers 200% of the world price of rice. It's a way to help Thai farmers. What was the consequence? Thai farmers produced a lot more rice. More rice and more rice and more rice. The government spent roughly 1/4 of the national budget just to buy rice. It effectively bankrupted them. And the rice is now rotting. It's just being spoiled. They cannot sell it. So the intention, they said we want to help poor farmers, but the consequence has been a disaster, a catastrophe. So I think we should look to the consequences, not only the intentions, but one way to do that is to think seriously about incentives. How will this law change human behavior? Now the next point is a very useful concept. It's called opportunity cost. Frederick Bastiat, an economist I like very much, and I hope his work will come out in Khmer. He wrote in French. He said there's only one difference between a bad economist and a good economist. The bad economist confines himself to the visible effects, and the good economist takes into account both the effect that can be seen and those that must be foreseen. So we take a very simple example. Let's say that the government proposes to build a bridge connecting an island to the mainland. Someone benefits from the bridge. We see the bridge. We see the people who drive on the bridge. It's clear, there's a benefit. What was the cost? The cost is what you had to give up in order to get the bridge. The cost is what did not happen. So it's hard to discuss it. We see the bridge. What was the cost? The cost is what would have happened if the bridge was not built. So take a very simple example. In the American state of Alaska, you know where Alaska is, it's way north, near the North Pole. Unbelievably cold place. In an island, it had a small population, the government built a bridge. The bridge cost $270 million to build the bridge. And people could drive from the island to the mainland. So there was a benefit to somebody. The construction companies got money to build the bridge. The union members got work to build the bridge. They're all happy. Only about 50 people live on the island. You could have bought everyone a fantastic, beautiful boat for less money than this bridge. Why was it built? Because the construction companies lobbied the state legislature. That's why. So what was the cost of the bridge? Well, $270 million. What does that mean? What if the taxpayers had kept their money? What would they have done? They would have bought something else. They would have paid for education for their children. They would have invested it. They would have saved for their old age. That didn't happen. We see the bridge, but we do not see the cost. And a good political economy asks what was the cost. Not only what was the benefit, which you can see. What was the cost? The cost is what did not happen. So it's very difficult to talk about it, which is why we have to use our brains and talk about those effects that must be foreseen. Every choice has a cost. Very simple notion. Each one of you is here. You made a choice to be here. You could be someplace else. That's the cost of being here. What would you do? Maybe you would have slept more this morning. Okay, that's nice. That's a cost. Maybe you would be studying for examination. You might be at the library. You might be meeting your friends. Whatever you would do if you were not here is the cost of the choice of being here. And we need to always think, what is the cost of behavior of a choice? Now, in English, people sometimes confuse these two words, the cost and the price. I don't know about Khmer, but in English, people use the two sometimes interchangeably, the one for the other. So I might say, I wish to buy this beautiful computer. How much does it cost? For $400, you would sell this to me? You would, okay. So notice I asked, what is the cost? But she answered with the price. It's a different idea. Cost is what I give up. Price is what is exchanged. So, $400, if I give you $400, you give me the beautiful computer. $400 is the price. But the cost to me is what I would have done with my $400. Maybe I would take a trip. With $400, I could go to the ocean and spend a week and have a fantastic vacation. That's the cost of buying the computer. So price is what you give in exchange. But cost is what I forego. It's what I lost by making the choice. It is very important to keep these distinct, especially in business. So not only in political economy, but in business. The cost of making a business decision is what, not only the price, what did I give up? So for example, I decided to buy the computer, $400. Part of the cost to me is the interest I could have received at the bank. If I kept my money in the bank, it would earn interest. That's part of the cost. But the price is only the $400. $400 in computer, that's the price. Another way to think of it is, what is the price of $400? One computer. Because the computer is what is given for the $400. So money has a price also. The price of money is what you give in order to buy the money. So if I'm a farmer and I sell watermelons, then we could say I buy money with my watermelons. The price of the money is the watermelon that I get. But be very careful to distinguish that from the cost. The cost is what I have to lose in order to make a choice. So those are helpful concepts, just to think clearly about these issues. Opportunity costs and the difference between cost and price. I want to talk about 5 basic principles very quickly. So I'll go quickly through these. The first, closed behavioral systems. It's a very simple idea. I'll explain it in a moment. What is methodological individualism? Because many people become confused about this. The third point, choices are made between alternate possibilities. We cannot choose things that are not available to us. Human cooperation rests on what is called comparative advantage. This is very important in international relations also, in business and in international relations. And the importance of institutions and incentives. So let's start. Closed behavioral systems is an application of what in logic is called Occam's razor. Occam was a medieval philosopher, and what he said was, you cut away useless hypotheses. We want the simplest explanation. Simple explanation is better than complex one, all other things being equal. So we want to avoid the multiplication of hypotheses, where you have a different theory for the market, a different theory for finance, for village life, and so on. If we can have one understanding of human behavior that explains life in politics, in business, in the village, in the city, it's better. The alternative is to have a different theory for every kind of human interaction. And that is not a very good scientific approach. So one theory that can help to explain village life, city life, rural life, urban life, life in Cambodia, life in Thailand, life in Germany, life in Japan. Right? There are fundamental principles that help us to understand all those. Now, very importantly, there's not a different behavior called political behavior that differs from economic behavior. Politicians, let's say Thomas here is a businessman and he runs for parliament. Does he become a different man? He's still the same person. He does not become smarter or wiser, more intelligent. He does not become a god. He's just the same guy he is now in parliament. But some people think that business people are always self-interested and politicians are always benevolent and only interested in the public good. We know this is not true. Okay, we just know this is not true. So we should be honest and realistic in our scientific approach. If you go from politics to business or business to politics, you're still the same person. You have limited information, limited knowledge. You're a mixture of concern for others and concern for yourself. No one loses all their self-interest when they go into politics. But for the same reason, when people go into business, they don't lose their love for their families and friends also. You don't become only interested in your own person. People who earn money also to help their families, to help their neighborhoods, to help their religion, and so on. We're a mixture of interests of our own person and those around us. So we want one theory to explain human behavior, not 20 theories for 20 different settings. The second point, methodological individualism, is sometimes stated in a very confused way. People say there are only individuals, there are no groups. This is not true. Of course there are groups. There's Zaman University, the faculty of Zaman University. They're a group. They interact with each other. There are nations. There's the Thai nation, my nation, Vietnamese, American, and so on. They have some differences. Right? So there are groups. Here's the important point. Individualism is contrasted with the idea of a group person. Put it very simply. There are individuals and there are groups. Families, communities, business firms, political parties, churches, temples, and so on. But those groups are not individuals like you and me. That's the key distinction. Cambodia is a nation composed of many other smaller groups. It's not a person. It's not just like me. The United States is a big country, but it's not a person. It's made up of many persons and their complicated relations with each other. That's what forms a group. Individual human beings and their relationships. So if we want to understand a business firm, it's not another person like you or me. It's a group of people, shareholders, who invest their capital, and they bear the risk. Employees who do work and receive compensation before the product is produced. People who loan money in the expectation of earning interest. Customers, suppliers, all of these individuals and their relationships. That's what makes a business firm. The same thing with the government, with a religion, a mosque, a temple, a synagogue, a church. It's individuals and their relations. But it is a mistake to think of the group like another person. It's not. It's a complex arrangement of individuals and relationships. So we think of, here's a tree like an individual person. And here's a forest, or a jungle. It's made up of many trees, but it is not a tree. It's made up of the trees and their relationships. Big trees, small trees, different kinds of trees make a forest. But the forest is not just a big tree. And society is not a big person. It's made up of persons and their complex relationships. If we want to understand how they relate to each other in business and politics and so on. The third point is that we make choices between alternate possibilities. Here's a very common way to think about political economy. I think it's the wrong way. We look at the market and we identify some problem with it. It's imperfect. Then we say, the government should fix it. But the assumption is the government is perfect. Well, that's not a very wise assumption. Government has problems too. So we should always compare real markets with real governments. And ask the question, if there's a problem, is government the best institution to solve it? Maybe, maybe not. But we should not assume that the government always has superior information or incentives to solve problems. It may make the problem worse. We always choose between real institutions. No market is perfect and no government is perfect. That's it. But a common mistake is people point to a problem and they say, the government must intervene. Sometimes it will make it worse and not better. And finally, if we want reform, we need to look at the way institutions shape incentives, and incentives shape behavior. Douglas North, who received the Nobel Prize in economics, focused on this. Institutions provide the incentive structure of an economy. As that structure evolves, it shapes the direction of economic change towards growth, or stagnation, or decline. So institutions and incentives are very important. We cannot normally choose the outcome. We can choose the rules that will shape our behavior. I'll take a very simple example. Right now, the United States is having a great debate internally about drug laws. Marijuana has been illegal for many, many years. But it turns out people still smoke it, even though it's illegal. Who knew? It's a surprise, right? In fact, if you wanted to go to America and buy marijuana, I can tell you where to buy it. The easiest place. Prison and high school. The two places it's clearly forbidden are the two places you can buy it like that, if you want to. It's illegal. So it must mean no one uses it, right? No, it doesn't. That's not true. People do use it. It's an illegal market. And it created terrible incentives. Organized crime, violent behavior, mafia, killings, shootings, as a consequence of this. People did not pay attention to incentives when they designed the war on drugs. The incentives made violent people very rich. The more violent you are, the more rich you can become in an illegal market. And this has driven violence and terrible suffering in the United States, and even worse in Mexico. Over 100,000 people have been killed in the last 6 years in Mexico, fighting between drug gangs. It's a really, really horrible fight. Now I'll give you another simple example of why incentives matter. I'll draw it from the United States again. Some people said, oh look, violent behavior, we should give maximum punishment. Maximum punishment. And the rule was, if you use a gun to commit a crime, you get the maximum sentence under law, maximum penalty. Okay? Sounds good, right? Why not? If you use a gun, shouldn't you get the maximum sentence, the maximum penalty under law? But this had a very bad consequence because they did not think about the incentives. It increased the murder. Think about why. Let's say I'm a very bad person, I'm a criminal. Just look at me, right? You can see I'm a criminal person. So I'm going to go to a store and rob and take the money. And a good way to do that is with a weapon, a knife or a gun. So I come in with my gun, say, give me the money. Now I committed a crime with a gun. If they catch me, I get the maximum penalty. So what am I going to do to all these people here who saw me commit the crime? Bang, 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 bang. I kill you all. Why? There's no additional penalty. And if you live, you can point to me and say, he did it. So I have an incentive now to kill you. This is a terrible law, a really bad law, because they did not think about the incentives for criminals. They gave the criminal an incentive to commit more violence by setting the maximum penalty for this crime. This was an example of not thinking. Remember, Bastiat said we should foresee the consequences. We should think about the consequences. And in this case, they only thought about their intention to be tough on crime. They did not think about the consequences. They did not think about the incentives. So let's look then at rules. Rules are important. They can be chosen. So I'll give you a simple example why rules are important. And you have it right now in Cambodia, the discussion of the new election law, the rules for the election. Rules are very important. If you get to write the rules, you can write the rules that are good for you and harmful to the other group. So rules are important. So let's give a simple example. Under political rules, there are two different fundamental rules. What's called winner take all, first past the post. This is the American system. America and Britain have this system. Whoever gets the most vote gets the seat in the parliament or the Congress. Even if you only get 30%, if it's the most number of votes, you get the whole seat. The other alternative is proportional representation. Any party that gets over 5% or 7% gets some representation. These two rules changes, these two different rules produce completely different kinds of political systems. The first one tends to produce a two-party system where you compete for what is called the median voter, the one in the middle. And the parties move to the center and they try to become very much like each other because they're competing with the median. Why? Simple rule. If we have a spectrum that goes from here to here, under this rule, winner takes all, we have this system. This is erasable, yes?
Yes. Yes.
Wanted to check first. Okay. So let's say we call this the right-wing party and the left-wing party, whatever that means. Just to you have to get more than 50% to win. So the parties can't stay here, they have to move, and they compete over what is called the median voter. The voter who's halfway in between. Not ideologically, but in terms of numbers. In terms of numbers. So the parties become very similar. And in fact, Democrats and Republicans in America are very similar. They're not very different. Because they're competing for the median voter. Let's say that a left-wing group says, hey, you're becoming too right-wing. We'll form our own party, the radical left-wing party. What happens? They're going to split the left-wing vote, and the right-wing will win. So what do the other left-wing voters say? They say, don't do that. No. You'll only elect the ones you really dislike the most. You're wasting your vote, is the phrase they use. And the same thing here. This group wants to form the real right-wing party. And their friends say, don't do that. You'll only elect the left wing. So the parties compete by getting closer together. Now let's look at proportional representation. Like Belgium has. Belgium has proportional representation. Belgium has a really interesting political system because they have many different political parties with all kinds of different views. Why? Because this group here can form its own party, and if they get 5%, they get into parliament. They don't waste their vote. They get representation. And so Belgium has a much more complex political system. But it's not because Belgians are more complex people. Right? I've been to Belgium. It's a nice place. They're a little boring. It's not. They have a very complicated political system because of the voting rules. That's the reason. It has nothing to do with their national culture. If you gave Americans this system, they would also have 20 different political parties in the Congress. And if you gave the Belgians the American system, you'd have 2 parties dominating the Belgian parliament. It's the rules of it. Yes, sir.
Just an interesting fact for the Khmer is that the Belgium, as a country, they hold the record for the absence of government, which is almost a year, because of ongoing negotiation. And this record was held by Cambodia before, from the standstill that happened in 1993. So they were holding this record until 2010, when the Belgium went incapable of getting a government in place 1 year.
Well, we're seeing it in Israel right now also. Israel has proportional representation, many different parties, and there's going to be a long negotiation to form a government. I have no strong view which one is better. I just want to explain that the rules have a big impact on the outcome. We can look at it in sports competition. There's an American economist who is a very tall man. He plays basketball. He's a really big guy. He's African American. His name is Walter Williams, and he has big hands. He was a basketball player. And he says, I can tell you, I could guarantee within 1 year, all of the top basketball players in America would be women. People laugh, they say, oh, come on, basketball is a man's sport. I can do it. And he takes bets from the students. He actually takes their money. He says, I'll change the rules that you must play the game wearing high heels. Taking shoes. So you have to wear high heels. Most of the male players would not be very good at that. Second, before you throw the basketball on a free shot, as it's called, for basketball, you have to knit a beautiful piece of Belgian lace. Very small. Well, these male basketball players have, they're big hands. My hand is very small compared to big. They can't do that. So he said, you could change the rules, just 2 sentences of the whole basketball rule book, and all the top players would be women very shortly. So rules are important. A lot of economic regulations appear what we call facially neutral. When you read the law, you cannot tell if it will favor or harm anyone. But in fact, they have very different impacts on different groups. This is very, very common. That it looks on the face of it, it's just neutral. But it was written because it will affect one group differently from another group. One group favored it because it advanced their agenda. But we can change, we can choose the rules. If we play a game, there are rules, and we play according to the rules. But we can also change the rules of the game. And that's what constitutional reform is about, changing the rules of the game. So I'll give a very simple example of a game. I use a game in a technical sense. It doesn't mean something that's fun, like sports. It means a strategic interaction. So here's a game we could all play. This game has been played in much of the world. It's called the game of choosing the state religion. And here's how it works. We fight, we compete. What religion will be the religion of the state? Those who win get the benefit of the state. And those who lose are burned alive. So let's play that game. We can have a vote. Who prefers Buddhism? Who prefers Hinduism? Who prefers Islam? Who prefers Christianity? And then within Islam, we could say, what kind of Islam? Shia, Sunni, different kinds of Shia. Within Christianity, there are of course different kinds, Catholic, Protestant, and so on. Within Buddhism, there are different schools of Buddhism. We can have that game, and it's called civil war, where we murder each other constantly. And a lot of human races played this game over and over and over. Huge numbers of people were killed. But we can change the rules of the game and play a different game. It's called the game of toleration. You go to worship where you want, and I go to worship where I want. I respect you, and you respect me. Someone goes to a temple, another person goes to a mosque, another person goes to synagogue, someone goes to church, and they can all live together peacefully. Now, changing from the first rule set to the second rule is very difficult. But it generates good consequences, in my opinion. When we change from religious oppression to religious freedom, we can all live together more peacefully. So that's a case of a game change. And that has to be done at a constitutional level. It's not easy to do. But countries that have achieved more civil peace have gone through the process of changing the rules. Now let's think a little bit about political markets here and some of the inefficiencies. Something called rent-seeking. How many of you have ever heard that phrase? Okay, some of you students. Okay. It's, in my opinion, not a very beautiful phrase in English. What it means is using politics to seek your own advantage against others. And we have the following problem. There's concentrated benefits and diffused costs to government behavior. I'll take a very simple example. The government proposes to subsidize some group. And they're going to charge everyone a very tiny amount of money. Let's say it's, I'll take the United States just because I know the numbers. Everyone pays 10 cents per year. Not very much money, 1/10 of $1. Times the population of the United States, we'll take the whole population, about 320 million. Okay, so it's going to equal $32 million in revenue. Now, there's $32 million to give out to benefit, to groups who benefit. People will lobby, they'll come to the Congress and say, oh, please give it to us. We think we deserve it. They'll spend money on campaigns and brochures and billboards and signs and radio advertising. Why you should give it to them? Farmers, hospital workers, nurses, whoever it is. But how many people will come to Washington to get back their 10 cents, their 1/10 of a dollar? Not one. Not one. Even if you want to call your representative in Congress, the telephone call will cost more than this. The price will be higher, and there's the cost, the full cost, which is your time, just to call them up and say, I'm against this. So people will not do it. Because the costs are diffused, 10 cents over all these people, but the benefits are concentrated in a small group of people. And so a great deal of government behavior takes wealth from lots of people and gives it to small numbers of people. Because the incentives are such that it encourages them. We call this rational voter ignorance. No one will march on the Capitol to save 10 cents. It's not rational. In fact, I'll give you a simple example of the sugar subsidy in the United States. Americans pay the highest price in the world for sugar. Why? Because there's small numbers of sugar growers in Florida and Louisiana who grow cane sugar. And then people grow beet sugar, it's a very stupid way to produce sugar, in Iowa and Indiana and other places. It's very inefficient to grow sugar in the United States, to be frank. You can grow it much cheaper in tropical countries where they grow sugar cane. But these sugar farmers are very powerful because there are few of them. So they lobby to keep out sugar from tropical countries, which is less costly. You can grow it more efficiently in Brazil or the Caribbean, or Cambodia for that matter. The consequence is that every time I buy sugar in America, I pay twice what you pay in Cambodia. But it's not very much money. I only pay a little bit every time I have a cup of tea and I put in some sugar. It costs me 1 or 2 pennies more. Not very much. But for the sugar farmers, it's worth millions and millions and millions of dollars. And they are very active lobbying in Washington for the sugar price support. But if you ask the average American, do you know about sugar price supports? Not 1 in 10,000 knows they exist. They've never heard of it. Because the cost is so diffused, it's so small. But over this big population, it's a lot. Now, it had an additional consequence that no one expected. No one makes candy in America anymore. Or I should be more accurate. Very few people. Why? We learned sugar is an important ingredient in candy. It was a surprise. So candy producers found that their sugar price was higher. What happened? Candy factories closed in America, candy factories opened in Canada, and the Canadians export sugar into America in the form of candy. That's what they're doing. They're sugar smugglers. But in the form of candies. No one expected that. It was an unforeseen consequence. They benefited the sugar farmers, but they hurt the consumers, and they hurt the candy manufacturers as a consequence of these policies. And finally, here's a question. Why do people vote? What is the chance that your one vote will determine the election? It's infinitely small. It's not going to happen. The number of elections determined by one vote is really tiny. There are not very many. There are few, actually, but not very many. So why do people vote? It's an interesting question. It's costly to vote. You have to register, you have to go, you have to stay in the line, you have to get ink on your finger, you have to do all those things. Why do people vote? And one reason is, it's a form of expression of their personal identity. I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, I'm an Islamist, I'm a secularist, etc., etc., etc. It's a way of showing who I am. Well, that has an additional cost, though. It allows us to express our identity at low cost but it can impose very high burdens on other people. Take the case of Israel, where religious voters vote a religious bloc. And because of proportional representation, they dominate Israeli politics. Most Israelis don't want to be at war with the Palestinians all the time. But the small extremist parties have the balance of power. They vote exclusively on the basis of religious preference, and they can impose the cost on the rest of society. So you can have very inefficient outcomes from what is called expressive voting, where I vote for something that turns out to be very costly to everyone else, but it didn't cost me very much to cast my vote. Now, here is one thing in economics. If you want to understand one thing from this, this is the one. Most important lesson, I think, of economics. The idea of comparative advantage. Paul Samuelson, an economist who got the Nobel Prize, was once asked a question about economics. The question was, can you name one thing in economics that is A, really important, and B, not obvious? He thought, he said this, comparative advantage. It's extremely important, but it is not obvious. You have to think about it. I think it's one of the most important insights in economics. So take a simple example of why comparative advantage matters. If we specialize in trade, we can consume more than we can produce. That sounds strange. How can you consume more than you can produce? I'll show you how. Very simple mathematical example. And I'll take two random examples. Sunram and Tom. Names chosen at random. So, let's say we have an economy of apples and fish. We have only two goods. Apples and fish. And Sunram has the absolute advantage in production of both. Let's say Tom specializes in fish, he can gather 50. He specializes in apples, he can gather 50. But at the same time, Sunram, who is much better, he can gather 100 fish in a day or 200 apples. So Sunram is better at everything. Why would he want to trade with Tom? Tom is inefficient. He's not very good at anything. So why would Sunram, who can get 100 fish or 200 apples, why would he want to trade with Tom? Tom is what is called in technical language a loser. He's a nobody. Right? He can't do anything right. So Sunram is really good at everything. Why would he want to trade with someone like Tom? Well, let's think about it. Let's assume that they produce in isolation. So they're living on two islands, Sunram and Tom, and they produce in isolation. They don't trade. But each one of them wants a balanced diet. Your mothers taught you, don't eat only fish or only apples, some fish, some apples. So they go 50% fish, 50% apples. So Tom, remember, in one day he can gather 50 fish or 50 apples. He goes half and half. 25 fish, 25 apples. Sunram can gather 100 fish or 200 apples. He goes half and half. 50 is 1/2 of 100. 100 is 1/2 of 200. So that's what they have. Sunram is richer than Tom, as you can see, in this isolation. Here's the Sunram Island and the Tom Island. Now, Sunram proposes a trade. He somehow, he gets a little boat, or he builds a little bridge. He comes over and says, Tom, would you like to trade with me? Okay, why not? So his trade that he proposes, he says, I'll give you 37 apples for 25 fish. Is it a good deal? Maybe. So Tom says, okay. So he shifts, remember, he was producing 25 and 25. He shifts 25 to 0, and 25 to 50. Sunram reduces his 50 by 1/2, goes to 25, and he increases his 100 by 1/2. He goes to 150. So the numerical ratios are the same. There's no change. The mathematics, the numerical ratios are identical. So now Tom is only gathering fish and no apples. Sunram reduced his fish production from 50 to 25, and he increased apples from 100 to 150. Now they trade. Tom took 25, remember he had 50. He takes 25 and moves them over to Sunram. Sunram had 25, now he goes to 50. So they're both the same as before trade. But Sunram had 150, Tom had 0 on apples, 37 come over here, Tom has 37, Sunram has 113. You notice something interesting? Tom now has more than he had before trading, and Sunram has 13 more than before trading. They both benefit from this. They can both consume more than they were able to produce. That's really amazing. And it took many hundreds of years for people to think about this. The one who did was a man named David Ricardo, who was an English merchant, businessman, economist, who studied this. And he wanted to understand trade between Britain and Portugal. Why the British were sending wool and receiving what is called port wine from Portugal. Now, you think about why it is. It's not really a mystery. There's no trick. It's all about comparative advantage. Sunram is more productive than Tom in everything, but Tom is the lowest cost producer of fish. Remember my discussion of cost? Cost is what you don't get because you make a choice. When Tom produces one fish, it costs him 1 apple. Remember, 50 or 50. But for Sunram to produce one fish costs him 2 apples. It's 100 fish or 200 apples. Every fish Sunram gets costs him 2 apples. His cost of production is higher than Tom. So when each one uses his comparative advantage, Tom produces fish, Sunram apples, right? 1 apple costs Sunram 1/2 of a fish, but it costs 1 whole fish for Tom. So they have different costs of production. Most people, when they talk about international trade, they make a mistake. They think of absolute advantages. But that's not what matters. It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter to trade. It's comparative advantage that matters. Cambodia has comparative advantages. Thailand has comparative advantages. Taiwan has comparative advantages. And we gain from using them. So let me use one more example of a mistake in this regard. Some people think that only producing manufactured goods is adding value. This is false. It's simply not true. It comes from Lenin's theory of industrialization, which didn't work very well in the Soviet Union. It's a mistake. The idea was only manufacturing, big factories, produce value. Agriculture is of no use. This is not true. New Zealand is rich largely from agricultural exports. Fresh fruit, wine, lamb, it's made them rich. Plus movies about elves and puppets. Another big export. The United States is a big exporter of food. Canada is a big exporter of food. France is a big exporter of food. These are all rich countries. There was a political debate in the US, I'll wrap up, between two candidates, and one of them was not very smart economically, said, it's terrible. America imports computer chips from Taiwan and exports potato chips. We should be ashamed of this. And Michael Boskin from Stanford University said, that's the wrong way to think about it. $1's worth of computer chips and $1's worth of potato chips are both $1's worth. It's value that matters, not whether it's a computer chip or a potato chip. Taiwan, they make very good computer chips. In Idaho, in America, they make really good potato chips. There's no shame in selling potato chips for computer chips. Thailand produces a lot of very good coconut products, right? Adds a lot of value. And other goods as well. So it's what do you add more value at? And now I've already seen one thing Cambodia can export. I already bought some. These medical goods, medical services. Medical tourism is a growing industry in Cambodia and Thailand. You have really smart people, highly trained. I went to the dentist yesterday. I'm really happy. I'm very happy. I had fantastic Cambodian dental care, and it cost me much less than I would pay in the US. I'm happy, they're happy, everyone should be happy except the American dentists. They don't like it. I like it a lot. So there are a lot of ways to use comparative advantage. This is one. Medical tourism is growing very rapidly in Asia. So, in business, we ask the question of management, make or buy. It's the question of comparative advantage. When you buy an automobile from Toyota car, did Toyota make the tires? No. But you can't drive a car without tires. They made the decision, we are not the least cost producer of tires, so they buy the tires. So in every business you ask, should we make it or buy it? Don't assume you should make it. Someone else might produce it at lower cost than you. You could buy it from them cheaper. And similarly, in international trade, produce it or trade for it. All human exchange is about this question. Produce it or trade for it. How can you do it cheaper? And last, we have a little bit more time. How are we out of time?
Half an hour.
Half an hour, okay. Oh, this will be quick. We can measure outcomes compared to institutions. The Fraser Institute of Canada runs the program called Economic Freedom of the World. You can download their report. It's online. It's an open source resource at freetheworld.com. And they look at all the countries of the world and they measure the degree of economic freedom. How costly is it to open a business? How easy is it to start a business? In some countries it's very easy, like Hong Kong. In other countries like Pakistan, it takes years. So all of these things can be measured. And then they look at countries, and here, very simple thing, they give each one a scoring. Hong Kong, #1. Cambodia is here at 72. Not that bad right now. It's been moving up on economic freedom. And these are quartiles, 25% of the countries, 25%. And so on. So let's look at some of the consequences. This is the average for the least free quartile. The average for the third, second, and first. So there's a pretty strong correlation between economic growth in the economy and degree of economic freedom. That may not look like very much, this difference, but actually it's quite a lot. If you compound year on year on year, 2% difference in growth rate after 20 years is very, very substantial difference in the outcome. This was an interesting thing. They asked this claim. They said, we'll check the following claim. People say the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. You hear this phrase. And they said, is it true? Maybe, maybe not. They looked at the income of the poorest 10% of the population. And what they found was consistently year on year, it's right around 2.5%. It varies ever so slightly, not by a great deal. And that was a bit of a surprise. But what does vary, we say this is invariant to economic policy. It doesn't change according to policy. What does change is what the income is. Or to put it very simply, if you're going to be a poor person in the lowest 10%, and you had a choice of what country to be poor in, you could be poor in Swaziland, in Africa, or Switzerland, in Europe. If you're poor in Switzerland, it means you don't have an iPad, which is too bad. Right? If you're poor in Swaziland, it means you don't have clean water to drink. It means you're illiterate. It means you've never traveled more than 20 kilometers from where you were born. And it means you hold your baby as she dies in your arms. That's what it means to be poor in Swaziland. No one suffers that problem in Switzerland. So it matters a lot to the poor what kind of economic order they're in. Income per capita, we went through that. This is a rather interesting relationship that deserves a lot more study. They looked at the relationship between political rights, whether you have open, free political contest, and civil rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and so on. And the relationship is quite interesting. It's positive, but it deserves a lot more study. This is something we need to study much more carefully. Does more political and civil freedom lead to more economic freedom? You can tell that story. India is a good example. Democratic freedom, 1991, opening of the economy, reinforcing system of more free, open society. Or South Korea, 1966, they began to open their economy when they joined the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, generated more middle class. That demanded more political freedom, and now South Korea is a politically, socially free country with a very free economy. But which caused which? It's complicated. It's something we don't understand very well. We look at how the world has changed in the last 2,000 years, roughly. Angus Madison, the economic statistician, calculated on the basis of objective data that was available per capita income. You notice it doesn't change, it's flat. It goes up a little bit in what the Southern Sung Dynasty in China, growth of Indian Ocean trade, the rise of urban civilization in Europe, Islamic societies in the Middle East, collapses in the general crisis in the 17th century, and then something happens right around here. Something amazing. Last couple of hundred years, we've seen a transformation in human life, unlike any before in human history. Really astonishing. You are the richest generation of human beings who have ever walked on the earth. If you think about the way the world has changed, it's mind-boggling. Take the numbers of people who are 65 and above. The number of the whole human race who have ever lived beyond the age of 65, almost all of them are alive now. Right now. So in my generation, I don't think of myself as that old. No one in my family ever lives older than me. I've lived longer than my parents and grandparents. I have a few more years, I think, left in me. Life is radically different for most of the human race. It's a really staggering change in humanity because of changing the incentives and the institutions. They matter. And lastly, we can look at this. Does anyone know what this is?
Korea.
Yes, the Korean peninsula photographed at night from a very, very tall ladder. And you'll notice something quite remarkable. It's a nice way to test theories. Why is this part totally dark and this part is full of light? Well, some people say your culture determines. Well, they're all Koreans. Is it culture? We have, for example, East and West Germany. There are others like this. What is the difference? Some people say if you are behind, you can never catch up. That's very common belief. If you're behind, you can never catch up. It's not true. It's true of some things. I had an older brother, and when we were both alive, I would never become older than he was. I could never catch up. Okay. But economics is not like that. The fact is, if we look at South Korea, in 1960 they were poorer than North Korea. Not anymore. In 1960, South Korea had the same per capita income as Ghana in West Africa. Not anymore. South Korea grew by over 35 times per capita income. Ghana, just a few times in the intervening years. Some people say if you're a victim of colonialism, you can never succeed. But Korea was victim of Japanese colonialism. The Japanese Empire was really very harsh and very brutal towards the Korean people. They tried to wipe out Korean language. It was forbidden to speak Korean. Korean women were raped. We called them comfort women for the Japanese army. It was really quite a terrible kind of imperialism. No imperialism is good. This was one of the really bad forms of imperialism. But it happened to all of them. This country is free and rich and a global leader in almost everything, even pop music and Gangnam Style and all around the world. It's about institutions and incentives. That's the difference. Not culture, not history, not language, not religion. It's about institutions and incentives. So with that, I'm interested in your thoughts, and maybe you can help to explain the contemporary reality of Cambodia to me better. Thank you very much.